The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents What Happened to You? It's actually a question that's come up a few times from friends I had back in high school, actually. Let me give you a little context because I've told my story a few times, but there are some specifics and some ideas that still left people confused. I was born in 1969. We don't have to go quite that far. At the age of 5, I walked down the aisle at Gashland Baptist Church in Kansas City, where my parents and grandparents on my dad's side attended church. And I accepted Jesus into my heart. And I'm told later, or I was told later, that my parents had concerns about whether or not this could possibly be a legitimate conversion. Could someone understand it at the age of 5? And I can understand why people would have concerns like that. I would too. But whether or not it was a real conversion, as I continued growing up in the church, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, I've talked before about how, when I got to be a teenager, I thought, ooh, I couldn't have understood this at 5 if I'm just understanding it now. And so what I'll do is I'll get saved again, or I'll do it right, or I'll rededicate my life, or whatever. And there was a little bit of a cycle thing that the church would do. I don't want to make it sound like they had, nefarious intent. This is just genuine. There are aspects of our life that are going to continue to be imperfect. You've fallen wayward in your walk with Christ, and blah blah blah. You need to rededicate your life and stuff. That was a cycle. You get lectures about sin and stuff, and boom, you haven't lived a perfect life. So you do it again and again and again. But also, you reach a point where it's like it's been reinforced so much that it becomes the default. I'm saved and going to heaven. Boom. Let's keep going. Let's go out and do the mission work, and let's do the visitation, and let's, go help rebuild a church in Illinois. I graduated from an incredibly big high school at the time, Francis Howell in St. Charles, Missouri. I graduated in 87. The school had like 900 and some odd kids in the graduating class. And so they split the school in half the year after that. So I don't think there's been a class that big in quite a while. But I had friends who mostly were from the same church. We were a pretty tight-knit group. As a matter of fact, I mentioned before, my brother created or was a part of a Facebook group just for kids that were in our youth group during that time. And I don't think I'm in that group anymore. I think the group kind of died out. And a number of people who were in that group who had just friended me kind of like, oh yeah, I remember Matt, click. Have since unfriended me. And some of them we've had conversations. Some of them we are still friends. And a few of them were like, what happened to you? And more recently it came out because I was having a disagreement with someone I knew in school about politics stuff. And it became very clear that our paths had diverged. And so the, what's happened to you thing popped back into my head because it's come up over and over again. So I graduated high school in 1987, but I was not I didn't have good grades. I was bored in school and skipped classes a lot. I did enjoy the computer lab though, and spent a lot of time there. I was kind of one of the typical kids in our youth group. I was probably slightly, less likely to do bad things than some and more likely to do some bad things than others. I mean, some of my friends were having premarital sex long before I ever did, and drinking and things like that before. And, we had fun. We were serious about God. We were serious about Christ. We were serious about our church and sharing our mission, but we also had fun, and we were normal kids. None of us were outstanding. Any of them who tell you that they were, I probably didn't know them. But because of that, my options were limited. I was smart. I was stuck in special programs in school, but I hated it because, you get teased and mocked and all this stuff. As, oh, you're in the gifted and talent class, whatever. It was obnoxious. And I I didn't feel like it. So there was the constant, Matt's not living up to his potential, which has continued. I'm going to be 56 here in a few days and probably still not living up to my potential, but so what? Doing better. I joined the Navy and I served 8.5 years in the Navy, and it was eye-opening. For a good chunk of it, I was like, in the later years, a Rush Limbaugh ditto head. Like, I can remember, working there with FibCB2 in Little Creek and going out to my car on my lunch break to listen to an hour of Rush Limbaugh out of his 3-hour radio program. And because I didn't have access to, people really truly challenging what he said, it was conservative propaganda that I just kind of bought into. And people are like, oh, Matt, how could you fall for something like that? It's easy. It's the same reason people believe a lot of things. There is conformity with the group. There are things that on the surface look and seem accurate and true and wise when just a slight distortion completely changes your perception of what's going on. When the internet started to take off a little bit more, I got access to more information, and some better and some worse. But when I got out of the Navy, I moved to Austin, Texas. A friend of mine that I knew from the Navy was here working for Dell Computer. And I wanted to come down and see if I could get a job. I ended up working for a different computer firm first. And then eventually I got a job at Dell. I started working in manufacturing diags. Then I went on to be the lead engineer for workstation FPS testing. And eventually I worked myself out of a job. Because I'm self-taught and because I didn't have seniority, the guys in my group that had been there for many years before me and who had, master's degrees in, computer sciences, they were warning me to slow down. I remember 2 of them specifically are like, hey, there's a long time to finish this project. If you get too much done too quick, they're not going to have anything for you to do. But I felt like I had to prove myself. And my dad had, tried to instill in me a good work ethic. I'm not sure that it ever took. I think everybody who knows me would have a fun little debate about work ethic, and as a matter of when it's things I enjoy and are convenient. But I was there doing the job, and I got better and better. And I got my project done 6 months ahead of schedule. And in my mind, that's to be rewarded. And in the company's mind, this happened to coincide with them needing to cut headcount. And so my boss called me in and said, look, we're really happy with your work, but you're done. And we don't have any work for you to do for the next 6 months. And I'm like, what? So they let me go. They gave me a massive severance package where I didn't have to work for a year, although I should have gone back to work right away. And I was frustrated. I was despondent. I felt like I had finally made it and had all of it yanked away. And I sat down for about 1.5 years to figure out how and why this happened. And because of what I've been taught growing up, I was convinced that God was punishing me because I had thought that God wanted me to be a preacher. My parents, or at least my mom, was convinced that God wanted me to be a preacher. People from my former church were convinced that God wanted me to be a preacher. And I was terrified of public speaking. I was terrified of interacting in that way. And so I went and joined the Navy, and then I went and worked in tech, and I thought God was punishing me and taking it all away. And so I decided right then, okay, I give up. If that's what you want me to do, God, I'd do it. I'm sorry for running. I apologize. I know that I've gone astray. I will do this. I need you to guide me and help me so that I can be the best representative of Christ I can be. Turns out, I've gone through the long story before, but it turns out the best representative for Christ I can be is evidently not a Christian. Once I realized that I had no good reason, I was trying to figure out a way to convince my atheist roommate and some other people that what I believe was true. And the more I dug into it, the more problems I found. The more I realized, hey, you don't actually have any good evidence. And the various arguments that you've been spoon-fed and bought into, turns out they're fallacious. I just wasn't ever taught about fallacies. I just wasn't taught about logic. I had done a lot with logic in the sense that I was an electronics technician in the Navy. I had worked as a hardware engineer and eventually as a software engineer and software test and hardware test. All of these things, sorry, not a hardware engineer, hardware test engineer, but all of those things required specific logical thinking. And I had basically trained myself to find problems. And I used to think it was a negative, but finding problems means you know what it's supposed to look like when it's right. And a fallacious argument doesn't mean that it's false. That would be the fallacy. Ba-dum-bump. A fallacious argument is one where the truth is unknown, where the value of the conclusion can't be determined. It might be true, it might not be. Your argument is no good. You might as well be saying, apples are red, the sky is blue, therefore the grass is green. That's not a valid structure for a syllogism, and yet the grass is green, or at least some of it's green. And so I dug into a number of different topics. I realized if I don't have good reasons to believe Christianity, surely somebody does. So I went and, I talked to an uncle who was a medical missionary, and I talked to a number of preachers, and they didn't really have anything. They gave me some things to think about, and then I went off and thought about them and studied, and things changed. I realized that those weren't good reasons either. And so I realized if I'm not a Christian, what other religion might be true? If I can't buy into the Bible, if I can't buy into this notion, and I realized I'm not going to have time in one life to explore all the proposed religions. So I need to find a way to narrow my search. And so I started studying philosophy and theology in general so that I could figure out what kind of God might exist in order to help narrow my focus. And I joke sometimes that realizing I wasn't going to have enough time to do it, I studied things like Buddhism first to see if I would have multiple lives to sort this out. But in any case, eventually I identified as an agnostic for about a week and then recognized that the correct term is an atheist. And that's not someone who, I am absolutely convinced there are no gods. An atheist is someone who is, I am not convinced that any gods exist. It's a non-theist. You might also believe that specific ones or any of them don't exist, but that's not the minimum requirement. I also found secular humanism, and I had been a skeptic the entire time. I had valued the work of James Randi and others, but I had not applied skepticism to my religion. And when I realized I hadn't done that, it was eye-opening that the same methods that I would use to evaluate the arguments for dowsing or ghosts or electronic voice phenomenon or Ouija boards, and all the things that I would use for that, if you tried to apply them to Christianity, Christianity fails to meet its burden of proof, and it's not close. And the same is true for every religion that I investigated, explored, and I'm unaware of any that can meet their burden of proof for what they're claiming, which is why the claims tend to get less specific. But what I did do is I didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. For example, when you start taking an inventory of your life and figuring out what's going on, you realize, hey, if I believe that murder is wrong because the Bible says thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not kill, I'm not going to get into translation arguments here, but I was convinced that it had a prohibition against murder. Now that I'm not a Christian, do I have any reason to be opposed to murder? Now, first of all, murder is a legal concept, not so much a moral one. It's about when killing is or isn't justified. And there are people who would say it's never justified and people who would say it's frequently justified. And that can change depending on the circumstances. And I realized that rather than there being any real sense of any sort of absolute, objective, externally imposed morality that was viable, in fact, our views on morality were situational and informed by both evidence and empathy. And as far as I can tell, it's about as good as we can get. Appealing to a God to say that your view of morality is right is no better than appealing to your Uncle Carl. Because until Carl or your God come down and give their justification, you're just the messenger. But that allowed me to say, you know what? I'm opposed to this and I'm in favor of that. Let me see if I have good reasons for that. All of my positions are now up for grabs? Do I have good reason to be saying what I'm saying and thinking what I'm thinking and feeling what I'm feeling? And in some cases, I found out, no, I didn't. I didn't. I had no reason to view abortion in the way that I did. I had no reason to view homosexuality in the way that I did. I had no reason to view piety or worship or sin in the way that I did. There simply wasn't a justification to support my former views. And so I sought out a way to discover what my views should be based on the best models, the best evidence. I've given lectures on the superiority of secular morality, and I've pointed out, and I stand by the fact that there is no solution to any problem people can raise with secular morality that is solved by appealing to a religious morality. You're still at the point where somebody's making assertions about things rather than demonstrations about things. And so I could say that I kept any of the teachings of the Bible or Jesus that were both true and good based on the best arguments and information, and that there was no reason to keep the rest of it, but there was strong reason to throw some of it out. I don't have to make excuses for what the Bible says about slavery. I don't have to make excuses for why women are second-class citizens in the Bible. I don't have to make excuses for any of the views that I had that do not have a foundation in evidence and empathy. It doesn't matter if my personal introduction to thou shalt not murder came from a Baptist church in Gladstone, or from a reading of the Bible, or from the guy down the street that says, hey, you probably shouldn't go around killing people. None of that matters. What matters is whether or not the idea is rational and better for the world. See, secular humanism has this goal of making the world a better place and seeking the tools that make the process of making the world a better place better. We get better at getting better. That's the goal. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We see farther because of the people who struggled. It's easy to look back on, our ancestors and say, oh, they got this wrong. It is. Slavery was always immoral, even though some people didn't recognize it. It was not better for any of us. It can be better in the short term for the slave owner that is hoarding wealth and making use of other people's work for their benefit while those people suffer. It can be in the short term beneficial, but in the long term, it's harmful to all of us. And so is ending education. One of the things when people say, hey, when I run into somebody from high school, like, hi, what happened to you? I shifted from indoctrination to learning. I shifted from being surrounded by people who share my views and don't challenge them to not only engaging with people who challenge them, but actively challenging them myself so that I am ready to defend my views at the drop of a hat. I basically took 1 Peter 3:15, which is to be prepared at all times to give a reason for the faith that's within you, and converted it to a secular version, because that's the command to essentially engage in apologetic defenses of Christianity. And I spun it into a secular direction, which is, I don't ever want to be saying something and have somebody say, why do you believe that? And be incapable of at least giving them some sort of cogent response so that they might understand why I think, so that they might either agree or correct it if they have a better way. I kept the good parts wherever I found them, whether it came from a religion, a TV show, any of those. Wherever I found something good, I hung on to it. And I learned more about people who were worse off than I was. I mean, don't get me wrong, we were not remotely wealthy. My dad was working a couple different jobs. We're eating, bologna sandwiches, and we're working to try to make sure that our family of four survives hard times, despite being, a blue-collar working class family. I had no idea how bad off we were many times, although I did have a nightmare once that I've talked about in another video, based on my parents arguing about money. But I realized that despite all of that, I was still way better off than most people. When I was a Christian, I viewed it as, I am God's. I belong to God. God's looking out for me. There's a reason I'm not homeless on the street. There's a reason why, even if we could have lost our house at some point, we didn't. It's just, this is what God wants. And then I started looking at the fact that I am the beneficiary of mountains of privilege. Not in every category. I'm still, in some categories, a marginalized, oppressed, mocked, whatever, minority. Try being an atheist, advocating for queer rights, advocating for leftist policies, advocating for socialist policies. Try doing that and not being continually marginalized. Try being supportive of people who are marginalized and see that you don't get some of the blowback as well. When I started talking about gender equality and how in the atheist movement and how it was just a bunch of white dudes for the most part. So we're talking about racial equality, gender equality. We want good representation. We want DEI. We want diversity. We want equity. We want inclusion, because all three of those things are good. We've gone from a DEI world to a nepotism and DUI world where we're appointing people who evidently can't maintain a hold on classical security for more than 100 days or classified things for more than 100 days. But I really wanted to do the things I'd always wanted to do, which was to learn and to share and to help try to make the world a better place. And so when I finally understood that I had advantages other people didn't, it came with, for me, a responsibility to make use of that advantage to help others. Trying to make this life a better place. You could say, I took the best teachings of Jesus and got rid of the rest. And there's a lot to get rid of. And it doesn't matter whether those ideas came from there originally or not. They're good ideas on their own merits. Life is its own reward. If there's another life, okay, that's a bonus. We'll find out about it then. But this is the one that matters. And right now, there are people who are suffering and dying and being continually marginalized, who, through no fault of their own, would prefer to just be left alone to live their lives, but some busybody somewhere decided that the type of life they want to lead doesn't line up with what they think Jesus told them to do. And so they're going to do everything in their power to stop it. None of the people who ask me, hey, what happened to you, have even made an attempt to argue that I am in fact wrong. None of the former pastors or folks from our church or youth group have made any attempt ever to say, here's why I'm correct about God, about Jesus. Here's why you should agree with me. Here's why what you're doing is of the devil. But many of them have said it's of the devil. I did a debate on the resurrection, and a deacon and some family friends from my former church traveled from Missouri to Texas to watch this debate. And one of them got up and asked the question, it's in a video we posted. What happened to you? We all thought you were going to go on to great things for God. I did go on to great things for humans, because I care more about humans than any God I've ever heard of. And I genuinely don't understand how anybody can hold a position that is the opposite of that. The people who disown their kids for not sharing their religion or being queer, that's not love. The love that I got from Christians after finding out I was no longer one of them isn't recognizable as even a remotely good thing. But the shocking part is that not a one of them can stand up and fulfill their obligation to explain why they are correct, why their position is the right one. And I'll end on this note. I had one of those good high school friends who was a Baptist youth group pastor who got divorced, then married a Catholic, then became a Catholic. We were talking, and he's like, I just don't understand it. We grew up believing the same things and taught the same things. How is it that you ended up an atheist? And I said, I've been sitting here asking myself the same thing about you. How did you end up a Catholic? And he says, oh, well, I like to drink, and they let me drink. And I understood immediately what the difference was, so I told him. I ended up an atheist because I took our beliefs seriously. I figured whether or not there was a God, whether or not there was an afterlife, whether or not Christ was the path, whether he was the way, was the single most important thing anybody could know. Because if it was right, it matters more than everything in this life. And if it's wrong, billions have wasted time, money, and lives promoting something that isn't true. I took it seriously. It wasn't just a club for me to join. It wasn't just where my family and friends were. It was truth until I realized it wasn't. In the same way that I realized the things Limbaugh had said weren't true. The ideas that I was opposed to didn't have good support. And it was a long transition. There was a year and a half that I spent before I went from losing my job to actually saying I'm an atheist. That was a year and a half of intense prayer and study and reaching out to pastors and friends. I'd be shocked if any of my former youth group friends or pastors had ever done that level of study. Because if you do that and you come out the other side with a solid foundation of belief, why aren't you posting it? Why aren't you sharing it with everybody? Why aren't you telling all of us the little thing we overlooked? Because none of them did. And apart from maybe as a glib response to this video, probably none of them will try. And that's okay. Because if it hadn't been for a couple of life instances that forced me to reconsider stuff, I might have just glibly gone along. Yep, I'm Christian, I'm saved. Oh, no, this is what God, because it's easy. Christians want to cry persecution. Oh, we're so persecuted. You're not persecuted, not in the damn United States of America. Persecution. Boo-hoo-hoo. Your Christ wasn't persecuted either. If in fact they exist, even if you're right, he had a bad weekend. There's no sacrifice in that. And the story is absurd, and the notion of sin is absurd, the notion of forgiveness is absurd, the notion of inherited sin is absurd. Every single thing. Zero evidence, no rational arguments, just faith. Well, congratulations. Please name something that someone couldn't believe based on faith. We'll wait. See you next time.